What's up, guys? Seen a lot of tension, news about People's Republic of China of late, and I thought it'd be interesting if we kind of dive into trying to see a little bit of the Chinese perspective or an understanding of why does why does the Chinese government not seem that concerned about human rights in particular. A lot of us, especially in the United States, we don't understand the way China operates or why they operate the way they do. Especially if we look at their totalitarian nature and what they're doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or however you say that place, and the way they support North Korea. And I will admit, it is pretty dang puzzling that while doing all of this, they're still part of our international organizations like the World Trade Organization, or that they took Taiwan's place at the UN Security Council. Don't get me wrong, even though I'm part Chinese, I am not sympathetic to their government in the slightest. But I think it is important that we try and understand the context in which they have such profound power. Why does the Chinese government not care about human rights? The CCP is a totalitarian regime, and it values its interests, its power above all else. And while states tend to do so, in an authoritarian state, it's more obvious. And the CCP has a tendency to, I wouldn't say misremember history, but use history to manipulate its people. If you've ever heard of the Century of Humiliation, it's China's victim card that allows them to behave the way they desire. Much like a certain country in the Middle East that also has a different victim card and uses it to get away with whatever it wants. You can probably tell who I'm talking about. The CCP's perspective is that it doesn't have any desire to conform to what it deems to be an outsider perspective or a Western pressure. I've said many times on this channel that democracy and things of that nature originated in the West. And to a lot of other places, they're seen as a foreign imperialist aim, norm, and pressure. The CCP is most proud of its economic achievement, which has elevated China back to its historical status quo as a global power. It looks past human rights violations for its prestige, power, and economic capability. And in truth, most countries, heck, the average voter in democracies, all they really care about is how the economy's doing. And under authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, especially those that have chosen to be capitalists like China, their focus on the economy is more obvious. I would say under President Trump of late, it's become that way too, which in truth I kind of appreciate. I like seeing more of the direct motives, more transparency. Focusing on the economy is honestly a good thing. If you're familiar with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states that all people everywhere have the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to work and gain education, which is based in Western thought and beliefs. And though all members of the UN are supposed to adhere to this principle, it's not legally binding. And the CCP's framework simply discourages the majority of these rights. The Human Rights Measurement Index of 2023 ranked China as the worst in the globe for safety from state and right to assemble. Dang. Pretty condemning report there. as I stated previously, the CCP or the PRC, they focus on their interests above all else. They reign uncontested, supreme. And in truth, when people think of China, the People's Republic of China, it should just be simply regarded as the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. That's the real nation, all right? It operates from the top. The judiciary and armed forces are all below the control of the CCP. Their interests come before everything else, be it international norms or international law. And the context of the UN's establishment and its initial hostile interaction with the CCP provides insights into the CCP's perspective and justification for its lack of sympathy and care for a principle that much of the international order respects and adheres to. In 1948, at the time of the UN's establishment, the UN still embodied a globe mainly dominated by the influence and interests of the Western world. Only by the 1950s and 60s, with the addition of former colonized territories, did the UN become a less Western-dominated international organization. The UN's political, and even the UN was not immune to politics. Said this again in a previous video. The UN's political preferences were made quite evident by having the Kuomintang, or the KMT, hold China's role in the United States Security Council, even though they were already in the process of completely losing the Chinese Civil War. In fact, I'd have to double check. I'm pretty sure they'd basically lost by then. They were in Taiwan by 1948. But the UN, still mainly dominated by the West in its early stages, remained particularly hesitant to the admittance of the CCP into China's slot in the international institution of the United Nations at that time. So given its lack of representation in the UN, the CCP had no qualms with fighting an open war against the UN in Korea. When the UN was fighting to defend South Korea, in the eyes of the CCP, which was of course dominated by Mao Zedong, this is not a war against a legitimate international coalition. The UN coalition was merely a new era, a new embodiment of Western imperialists that threatened China's territory, sphere of influence, and sovereignty. So, the Korean War set the foundation for the CCP's view and regard to the UN. In addition to confronting the UN directly in armed conflict, by the time China, led by the CCP, was admitted onto the UN Security Council, its skeptical suspicion of the UN remained. It views the UN and the complaints of other nations as a mere tool to try and bend China to the will of the West. And though the CCP was eventually admitted into the UNSC, the UN's hesitancy left lingering feelings of frustration and a lack of trust between the CCP and the UN. They were admitted back in 1971. If the CCP were to develop an interest in human rights, then it could lose its power and prestige. We see that the CCP's refusal to be more understanding towards Tibet and to give any semblance of autonomy. It reflects its fear that giving any ground to dissidents could convey weakness, that the internal and external opponents would capitalize on such weakness. Tibet plays too important a role in terms of resources, territory, and location for the CCP to merely let Tibet have human rights and greater autonomy. And to China's credit, the West is not immune to looking past human rights. Throughout the Cold War, the United States government backed a number of allied authoritarian regimes that their human rights record was not phenomenal. So the CCP cites these prior inconsistencies with protecting human rights as further evidence that the West, led by the United States, is hypocritically seeking to upend China's progress. And I guess they do have some sense in that if the US could look past human rights violations in any number of regimes in Latin America, Southeast Asia, or East Asia proper, especially in South Korea and Taiwan, in some sense it does come off as a little hypocritical that why can't we all just get along? Why can't we just acknowledge that the CCP isn't perfect, much like these other regimes weren't? But I would argue it's a little more complicated than that, and I guess there is some component of our own interests at play, and that the CCP's economic progress and military progress threatens our interests directly, and that's why we can't see eye to eye on this thing.
President and Ms. Park, Mayor and Mrs. Krim, Prime Minister and Mrs. Chung, ladies and gentlemen. To an American, the free soil of Korea is hallowed ground. "16 years ago, an invading army from the north swept down upon your land. Long and tragic months followed, bringing grief to thousands upon thousands of good Korean families. And in the tide of war, this city was fought over, not once, but several times, and virtually destroyed."
The CCP has observed that adherence to Western norms could bring about the collapse of communist governance. And the CCP learned from the Soviet Union's failures in the game of international competition, the long game. The USSR under Gorbachev went too far in allowing human rights to be abided by, which contributed to its collapse, and the CCP has no intention of collapsing in a similar fashion. This historical observation, combined with the Sino-Soviet split, has compelled the CCP to forge its own path.
我要对刚才这个记者涉及到中国的问题，要做一个回应。
I want to make a response to the questions asked by this journalist about China.
你的提问充满了对中国的偏见和所谓不知道从什么地方来的傲慢，我是完全不能接受的。
I have to say that your question is full of prejudice and against China and arrogance, where I don't know where that come from, and this is totally unacceptable.
你了解中国吗？你去过中国吗？你知道中国从一个一穷二白的面貌，把6亿以上的人摆脱了贫困吗？你知道中国现在已经成为人均$8000的一个世界第2大经济体吗？如果我们不能够很好的保护人权的话，中国能取得这么大的发展吗？你知道中国已经把保护人权列入到我们的宪法当中吗？我要告诉你，最了解中国的人权的状况不是你，而是中国人自己。你没有发言权，而中国有发言权。所以请你不要再做这种不负责任的提问。中国欢迎一切善意的这种建议，但是我们拒绝任何无端的指责。
I have to ask whether you understand China. Have you been to China? Do you know that China has lifted more than 600 million people out of poverty? And do you know that China is now the second largest economy in the world from a very low foundation? Do you think development is possible for China without protection of human rights? And do you know that China has written protection and promotion of human rights into our constitution? And those who other people don't know better than the Chinese people about the human rights condition in China. And it's the Chinese people who are in the best situation, in the best position to have say about China's human rights situation. So I would like to suggest to you that please don't ask questions in such an irresponsible manner. And we welcome goodwill suggestions, but we reject groundless or unwarranted accusations.